Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout, where today we're going to be talking about armor in Fallout and kind of how armor progressed in the older Fallout games compared to where it is in the more modern games. So armor wasn't really always quite the same. I mean, it always served the same sort of function as it did in the first game, all the way up to Fallout 4, where it is meant to protect you. That is the main job of armor, and that does make sense. A lot of RPG games have armor in them. Now, in the first Fallout game, and honestly from Fallout 1 to Fallout Tactics, armor was kind of just in a progression system where you just got access to better armor as you played the game. You didn't actually start out with any armor whatsoever. In Fallout 2, you didn't even start out with the jumpsuit, you just had like the tribal garb on, and then once you got the jumpsuit, then that was like your new standard outfit that you'd be wearing. Neither of those actually came with any protections whatsoever, though. The only kind of defense that you'd have in that sort of clothing, or really any sort of clothing in these games, would be the AC rating, or the armor class. Armor class was basically dodge chance, so the higher the dodge chance, the less likely you were to get hit in general, which is another form of sort of armor. It's a way to avoid certain things. So lighter armors tended to have that more so than just straight up defense. However, once you got some other armor on there, it might have additional armor class, so you have more dodge chance, and it would also give you some sort of resistances. Now in Fallout 1, you actually only had 8 armors in total. There wasn't very many. The first one you get access to would be like the leather jacket. This one was a direct reference to Mad Max. It looks very similar to the Mad Max outfit, and it would be pretty much a staple throughout the Fallout series from here onward. You see leather armor in all of the Fallout games. And armor in the older games also had multiple different resistances, whereas in the later games, not so much, where your armor could have the AC class, so how much you had to dodge, normal damage resistance, which was basically anything ballistic or physical that didn't also count as a second element or anything like that. But you'd also have laser resistance, fire resistance, plasma, explosive, and electrical. So you could kind of wear armors to potentially counter certain types of weapons. Generally speaking, though, armors that kind of covered everything decently well enough were good. So in the first game, you would likely start out with the leather jacket, and then you could upgrade into either the leather armor or the metal armor, because you usually got them around the same time. That's actually pretty standard for the Fallout series. That would remain throughout them, where leather and metal armor would just be a staple. And leather armor would be more chance to dodge in the older games, as well as certain higher resistances towards certain types of attacks, whereas metal armor would be less chance to dodge, but generally more defense oriented. And you'd kind of see that in the later Fallout games, where leather armor would be light armor and metal armor would be heavy armor. And even in the older games, that would be the same case. Leather armor was always lighter than metal armor. Once you got past that, in the original game, you would have Tesla armor, which was kind of its own specialized armor, as well as robes, which were more like unique armors that you may not actually even bother using, because by the same time that you're able to get these, you could get like the combat armors, which would also kind of remain throughout the Fallout games, and were just kind of upgrades over them, but more expensive. And then in the first game, you would move on to the power armor, and the power armor would be the strongest armor outside of the hardened power armor, which is just upgrading your power armor into that. And power armor was basically just the best armor across the board. It resisted basically everything pretty well. It weighed a lot, but it gave you extra strength, which was really good on pretty much any character, because at the very least, it's just giving you more carry weight. And funny enough, in the first Fallout game, you didn't really need like power armor training to wear the power armor, although it is kind of implied that you got training from the Brotherhood, since they're really the only ones that have power armor in Fallout 1. So that's where you get your power armor, and that's the strongest armor to start out with. But as you can see, there wasn't really a reason to be still wearing lighter armor into the late game of Fallout 1, because something like leather armor was never going to compete with power armor. Power armor has more dodge chance, it has more resistances across the board, it gives you stat bonuses, which are all really, really good. It also just has higher damage thresholds as well, so if you are getting hit, you're going to get hit for less damage, so you're just more likely to dodge, more likely to tank through hits, and you get more bonuses. And that would pretty much remain the case into Fallout 2 as well, where to start out with, you didn't have any armor, you would get something like the leather jacket, but then you could get like the combat jacket, which was an upgrade over that, or you could get leather armor, you could still get like your metal armors, and there was more models of the different armors in this. Pretty much all the same armors that were in Fallout 1 moved over to Fallout 2, but then we also got like leather armor Mark II, metal armor Mark II, combat armor Mark II, and like the Enclave power armor, which was the advanced power armor. And it was pretty much like the same sort of progression system in Fallout 2, where if you were playing the game normally, you would probably just start out with leather armor and your most likely going to be ending with the advanced power armor or the hardened power armor, whichever one you enjoyed, because that was just kind of the natural progression of it, where even compared to one another, the leather armor still didn't have anything besides its weight advantage over the power armor, since power armor gave you way more protection and it just gave you bonus stats. In Fallout Tactics, this would basically be the same type of thing, where armor was sometimes sold by random vendors that you could find around in different encounters, but generally speaking, you weren't going to be getting good armor into Fallout Tactics until you got further into the story, and you could actually buy it from the Brotherhood, because the Brotherhood just had the best stuff then, and you were always part of the Brotherhood in Tactics. So you, again, would start out with leather armor. Well, you'd actually start out with leather armor in this one, and then you could upgrade it into like leather armor Mark II. You could go with metal armor. One of the best armors that you could get early on into Fallout Tactics was actually the environmental suit, because it was decent in terms of all resistances, and one of the vendors sold one of these, so somebody on your team could have that right away if you went out of your way to go and get enough money to go and then buy this. There was also some other interesting armors in Fallout Tactics. There was still the normal stuff of like leather armor into metal armor into the environmental suit, which was more of like the radiation suits that we got in later games, and then you go into like power armor after that. So pretty straightforward, pretty linear in terms of progression. There was a couple other armors in Tactics. Some of them were held by different characters, like Raiders and Reavers would have their own armor. Reavers were basically like cyborg people, sort of. As well as you had some gimmick armors in Fallout Tactics, which were pretty funny too, like the Brahmin armor, which allowed you to turn into a Brahmin, and you could also get the Devil Thorn jacket, which was a reference to Diablo, where it had a bunch of Diablo stats on there and you couldn't actually equip it. So that was kind of silly. I did think it was funny that they added those armors into the game, even if like they're not really all that crazy. You don't really need to have them, but they are funny from extra events. As well as in Fallout Tactics, you also had to take into account which characters could wear what armors, since you were building up a squad of different people. So humans could wear basically all the normal human armors, so anything from leather armor up to power armor. Same thing goes with ghouls. Ghouls could use all the same, although they came with their own ghoul armor, which was basically the equivalent to leather armor. I don't know why there was really like a separation between the two. Super mutants kind of got their own separate armors, and then people like Deathclaws couldn't have certain armors. Super mutants and Deathclaws also couldn't get into power armor or anything like that. So it did kind of make sense when you were building up your team as to what everybody got. And each race kind of got their own advantages and disadvantages for wearing different things. So there was a little bit more complexity in Fallout Tactics, but it was still generally a linear progression of you start from leather armor and you go all the way up to power armor, or advanced power armor in this case. It wasn't really until like Fallout 3 where we actually got a distinction between different armors and why you may want to be taking them, as well as some limitations, because Fallout 3 was the first one to introduce power armor training, to where you needed to have that perk before you could actually even wear power armor. Now, you could still argue that power armor was the best in Fallout 3, and I wouldn't really disagree with you, because it was pretty strong, but there was still reason to be using certain types of armors. Generally, you'd start out with your armored vault suit, which was decent enough. You could get that one right away just from talking to Moira, which you were very likely to do. You could also then, like, pretty easily get combat armor, and that would be a pretty good substitute for just about any armor, since combat armor was fairly common. It protected well enough. It was more of a medium armor than it was a heavy armor, and some of them came with bonus effects, like the Ranger battle armor was still really, really good, and armors like that weighed less. So there was more of an incentive in Fallout 3 to potentially not go out of your way just to use power armor, not going such a linear progression, even though like the main story kind of pushes you in that way anyway. Since, at least if you're doing the main story, you're going to get power armor training at a certain point, and you're even given a suit of power armor. That's not necessarily the best suit of power armor, because you can go out of your way to get things, but this would change as well in different DLCs, especially if you wanted to go there without any sort of armor. If you're going to Anchorage, you just got the combat armor, you didn't have any other option. And then in like the pit, you got all your gear taken away, so you just had to make do with whatever armors you could find, which was a pretty cool thing, and the pit armors were actually pretty decent for how lightweight they were. So there was more dynamic to armor in that game. Armor would change once again in New Vegas, where there was more of a reason to go with different armors, because now the armors were a lot more similar to one another in terms of defense, as well as they had their own bonuses to them, where you had the light, medium, and heavy armor as well as clothing. But light armor would actually give you quite a few bonuses, and it had perks related to it, so if you're going with, let's say, a sniper character, it might make sense to just throw on some light armor because you're very likely to not be getting hit, which is pretty useful. Whereas something like heavy armor gave you the most amount of protection, but it did weigh the most, as well as the armor itself may come with some actual downsides. Medium armor was kind of a compromise between these two, being still fairly defensive, giving some sort of buffs, and also still not being super heavy, so you could kind of go with that. So there was more of an objective reason to be going with each different set of armor, especially depending on the character build. Once we got to Fallout 4, armor would then kind of change, because armor would sort of be simplified in a couple of different ways. And not necessarily for the best, because armor did get more complex in Fallout 4, where you had each individual piece of armor, and those ones could have their own upgrades, which gave you a whole lot more customizing to your actual outfit. However, there were some ways kind of around this. Power armor was sort of its own separate resource. It had its own separate fuel now, and you could wear that, and that would give you a ton of stats overall. Power armor was incredibly strong in Fallout 4, and even though you may think that you don't have enough power cores early on, generally that wasn't that big of a deal. If you were exploring pretty often in Fallout 4, you were generally going to be getting enough power cores to keep your armor running at really any point in the game. And it could also be just as customizable as your regular armor, which could go over the top of your regular armor. On top of that, there was also like the ballistic weave in Fallout 4, which made it so basically any armor could just be as strong as you wanted it to be, and it would be reasonable enough for you to be wearing that. Meaning that it became less of which armor was technically like the best, and it just became which outfit you really like the most. Just kind of wear that. There was still some really good pieces of armor. Armor could also be moved around pretty heavily because there was legendary effects in Fallout 4 as well, and some of those you may just want to prioritize over others. So armor got both more complex and kind of more simple in Fallout 4 overall, where it became less about necessarily going with whatever the highest defense thing was, but just whichever one you like the most that gave you enough protection. So it's been pretty interesting to see how armor has progressed, and I do like it more in the later games than necessarily in the early games. And I have gotten a couple of questions asking if I'll do like a Fallout, the early series of like armor tier lists, and not really, because you generally just go from like point A to point B and then onward, where you get like leather jacket is better than no armor, leather armor and metal armor are better than leather jacket, just depending on which one you want to take, and then combat armor is better than both of those, and then power armor is better than the combat armor. So that's the whole list. There's nothing really else to talk about. Whereas in like the later games, that's not really the case. You got a whole bunch of different options to pick from, and I do think that that's pretty good. I also really liked all the customizations we got in Fallout London, because that gave you even more things where you had like different pipes that you could have, and glasses and hats and helmets, and you could like stack all these things. You could stack like clothing on top of this with gloves on it and stuff, and I would like to see more of that in the Fallout series in future games. That would be really cool. You kind of get that in like Kingdom Come Deliverance as well, where you can actually wear like your clothing and then your padded armor over it and then your actual metal armor over that. I kind of like that layering of the different armors, clothing, things like that you can have on. So hopefully we get more of that in the future. Tell me your thoughts on the progression of armor in the Fallout series. I would love to hear that. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.